At dawn she walked alone, cast out by her people, burdened by shame, yet carrying a will the desert itself could not break. She walked away from her people beneath a gray dawn, her braids still heavy with the dust of the council fire. The women of her tribe had turned their faces from her, whispering that her body was a curse, that her presence brought shame. They did not raise their hands to stop her, nor did they grant her final words of farewell. Silence had been the last thing they gave her, a silence so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. A single shawl clung to her shoulders as she trudged into the desert. The fabric was thin, the fringe worn from years of use, and it smelled faintly of smoke from the lodges she would never see again. Snow still lingered in the shaded hollows of the cliffs behind her, cold white patches that caught the weak light of morning. The sky stretched pale and endless above her, its color neither day nor night, but a weary in-between. She carried nothing but an old knife in her belt and the memory of songs once sung for her, songs of childhood, of belonging, of a name that had meant something before it became a burden. The knife's handle was smooth with age, carved by her grandfather's hand. Yet even that inheritance felt like a question now. What was a tool of survival worth when survival itself had been denied her by the only people she had known? The desert gave no comfort. Its silence was different from the tribe's silence, less cruel but no less heavy. The wind rasped against her skin like dry reeds, lifting the hem of her shawl and pulling strands of hair loose from her braid. She licked her lips, already cracked, from thirst, and felt the ache of hunger gnawing at her belly. The land offered no fruit, no root, no hand to guide her steps. By midday the sun burned without mercy, and the horizon wavered in shifting bands of heat. Her moccasins gathered dust until each step felt weighted with stone. She thought of the council fire, the circle of stern faces, the words that had condemned her. They had not struck her down. No, banishment was slower, a wound that bled day after day, mile after mile. When night fell, it did so suddenly. The desert cooled as quickly as it had burned, the air turning sharp with frost. She gathered twigs, brittle and scarce, and coaxed a meager fire into being. Its light flickered against her face, softening the hollows beneath her eyes, though it gave little warmth. She pulled the shawl tight around her shoulders and crouched near the flames, listening to the vast emptiness pressing in from all sides. Above her, the stars scattered in their thousands, too many to count. They seemed close enough to touch, yet each shimmered with a coldness that reminded her how small she was, how easily forgotten. She traced the familiar constellations, the same ones her mother had pointed out long ago, and for the first time she wondered if her mother still looked at them too, or if she had already turned her gaze away. The loneliness struck her harder than hunger. Hunger was a sharp pain in the gut, a hollow that could be endured with clenched teeth. But loneliness gnawed at her mind, her heart. It whispered that she no longer belonged to anyone or anywhere, that no braid, no scar, no memory tied her to home anymore. The songs she remembered faltered in her throat, half-formed, breaking apart before they reached the air. She pressed her palm against the earth, feeling the grit of sand, the cool firmness of stone. At least the land still accepted her touch. The land did not call her cursed. Yet the land did not love her either. It asked only that she endure, or else it would bury her without pause. The night stretched long. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their voices rising and falling in a chorus that reminded her of laughter, yet laughter twisted into mockery. She drew the shawl over her head, hiding from both their voices and the stars. Sleep came in fragments, broken by shivers, broken by memories. She saw the faces of the women braiding one another's hair, weaving strands tight with affection and belonging. She remembered sitting among them once, the pull of fingers at her scalp, the smell of herbs woven into the plaits. Now her braid felt like a chain, a remnant of something she no longer deserved. When dawn crept again over the desert, the fire had long since died to ash. She rose stiffly, every muscle aching from the hard ground. Her throat was parched, her stomach hollow, but her feet carried her forward anyway. Something deep within her refused to let her sink into the dust. She did not name it hope. It was not as warm as that. It was something quieter, colder, but stronger. A refusal. a defiance that whispered, "Not yet." The cliffs faded behind her, and the land stretched wide, open, merciless. Each step was an act of will. Each breath was a declaration that exile had not yet claimed her life. She knew she belonged nowhere, that her name had been stripped away. Yet in the silence of the desert she also began to sense a truth, one fragile, one uncertain, but still alive. That the body they had cursed, the body they had cast out, still carried her forward. That as long as her feet pressed against the earth she was not finished, not yet. Days later, when her legs could scarcely hold her and her lips had cracked with thirst, she stumbled upon the edge of a wide pasture. Fence lines stretched before her, posts driven deep into the earth, wire glinting faintly in the dying sun. Beyond the fence, cattle moved slow and heavy, their silhouettes dark against the rolling grasslands. The smell of animals and dust reached her first, a scent so full of life it nearly broke her knees beneath her. She leaned against the wooden post, her body trembling, breath shallow as a wounded bird's. The sky above darkened with storm clouds, promising rain but not yet giving it. She pressed her cheek to the rough grain of the fence, whispering a prayer that her legs could no longer carry. Then her vision blurred and she fell into the dirt. It was not death that came for her, but a man. He found her crumpled near the fence line, her shawl stained with dust, her braid undone. His boots thudded in the earth beside her head. When she forced her eyes open, she saw the outline of a broad figure, shoulders squared, a rifle resting across his back. His hands were weathered, dark with sun, the knuckles marked by years of work. Without a word, he lifted her with care she did not expect and carried her toward a small ranch house crouched against the plain. Inside, he laid her near the fire, the glow of it washing her face in gold. Heat pressed against her skin, sharp after days of cold nights and barren wind. He set a tin cup in her hand, black coffee, bitter and steaming. She drank greedily, though it burned her tongue, and still she kept drinking. The taste was harsh, unfamiliar, yet it steadied her. He asked no questions, not then. He only watched from his rocking chair, its old frame creaking in rhythm with his slow movement. The fire snapped and popped between them, its light catching the hard lines of his jaw, the furrows carved by sun and sorrow. His silence was rough, but it was not cruel. It was the kind of silence born of habit, of a man who had grown used to the weight of his own thoughts. Outside, cattle lowed in the distance, their voices drifting like low thunder. From beyond the window came the smell of rain rising, sharp and heavy, though the storm had not yet broken. She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders and let the warmth of the hearth seep into her bones. Her eyes wandered the room, boots caked with mud resting by the door, spurs dulled by long miles, a row of tools hanging neatly on the wall. Each spoke of a life built by hand and held together by stubbornness. But what caught her breath was a chest in the corner, its lid closed tight. Draped over it, folded with care, was a wedding dress. The lace had yellowed with years, yet it had been kept free of dust as though the rancher's hand had not let it be forgotten. The sight of it stirred a pang she could not name. Loss, perhaps, or longing. He followed her gaze for a moment, then looked away, saying nothing. She did not press. Some griefs were too deep for questions. The hours passed slow. The storm broke at last, rain lashing against the roof, rolling like drums across the plains. The fire hissed as drops found their way down the chimney. She felt her body loosen under the shelter, her eyelids growing heavy, though her mind still clung to fear. She had been cast out, called cursed, left to die. What reason had she to trust a stranger? Yet his silence held no judgment. He neither turned his face away nor reached for her with unearned claim. He simply rocked in his chair, eyes steady, as though he, too, knew what it was to live alongside ghosts. For the first time since her exile, she felt the faint warmth of belonging, fragile. Yes, like smoke drifting in the wind, but real enough to breathe. She did not yet know if she could trust him, nor if he wished her to remain beyond the night. But as the fire burned low and the storm softened to a gentle rain, she let her eyes close with the smallest flicker of peace. It was not home. Not yet, but it was not the desert either, and that for now was enough. The days bled one into another, slow and deliberate as the turning of seasons. Morning came with the smell of coffee boiling black in the pot. Its bitterness carried through the cabin like a ritual. The rancher would pour it into tin cups, set one before her without a word, and settle into his rocking chair, watching the dawn creep over the hills. She took to small labors first, mending torn shirts, sweeping dirt from the floorboards, fetching water from the pump that groaned in protest. Soon she found herself beside him in the fields, her shawl tied firm against the wind as they worked the fences that sagged with age. She drove nails, her palms blistering, and he tightened wire with hands that seemed carved from the very land. The rhythm of work steadied her, though shadows still lingered at the edges of her thoughts. At night, when the coyotes howled from the ridges, the sound pressed against the windows like voices from another life. In the fire's glow, she would lower her head and see again the council fire of her tribe, the circle of faces, some hard, some sorrowful, but all resolute in their verdict. She remembered the way the women braided one another's hair, weaving strands into patterns of kinship and belonging. She had sat among them once, her scalp tender beneath gentle fingers, laughter rising around her like a shield. Those braids had been cut from her, severed with exile, leaving her to bind her own hair in silence. There was a scar along her side, pale against her skin, a mark left by a wound that might have killed her long ago. Sometimes her hand found it in the dark. It had been both a proof of her survival and the excuse for her rejection. Her body, marred and different, had become the tribe's shame. She traced it now as if to remind herself she was still here, still breathing, even when memories tried to unravel her. The rancher, too, lived among ghosts. She saw it in the way his eyes lingered on the chest in the corner, where the wedding dress lay folded, never touched but never forgotten. Its fabric, yellowed with years, carried the weight of promises that fever had stolen. He never spoke her name, his wife's, but the silence around that dress was as sharp as any word. By the door stood his rifle, polished though rarely fired. It seemed to wait with him, a sentinel against threats that never came, or perhaps against a past that refused to leave. She wondered if he oiled it out of habit or if the motion was a way to keep his hands from trembling with memory. Their silences met like two rivers, wordless, heavy, unyielding. Yet in those silences something lived. She began to recognize it when he handed her tools without asking, or when she left a cup of coffee for him on mornings he rose late. It was not yet kindness, not yet trust, but an understanding that did not need voice. One evening the sky darkened with storm clouds, and rain hammered the roof like fists upon a drum. The wind whistled through the cracks of the cabin, and water ran in rivulets down the window glass. They sat by the fire, the room pulsing with the storm's fury. The flames danced high, shadows stretching across the walls, as though the past itself had come to sit with them. It was then that he spoke, his voice low, roughened by disuse. "I thought I was cursed once," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "When she died, I reckoned it was the land's way of telling me nothing good would grow here, that I wasn't meant to hold on to anything." She looked at him, his face lined with years, eyes tired yet steady. She did not speak, but she knew what it was to feel marked by fate, branded by something that made others turn away. His rocking chair creaked as he leaned forward, his hands clasped tight. "Loss carves hollows in a man," he said, "makes him less than he was, or more empty. Sometimes I think the land only keeps me because it's too stubborn to bury me." She touched the scar at her side, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. The words trembled on her tongue, but she let them stay silent. Instead, she held his gaze, and in that meeting of eyes something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition, a knowing that they both carried wounds invisible to most, wounds that shaped the way they breathed and walked and looked at the world. The storm raged on, hammering the roof, rattling the windows. Yet inside the cabin there was a quiet, fragile stillness. She realized then that she was not as alone as the desert had told her. He too bore scars, different but carved by the same cruel hand of loss. And perhaps, just perhaps, two hollows pressed together might form a vessel strong enough to hold something new. Peace never lasted long in the West. It was a land that bore grudges like scars, a land that gave little and asked much in return. For a season, the days passed in their quiet rhythm, mending wire, boiling coffee, tending to cattle. Yet even in that fragile stillness, the woman felt a shadow gathering on the horizon. It began with whispers. A rider passing through the nearest settlement brought word of men moving across the plains, rough men with little patience for law. They took what they pleased: land, cattle, blood. The rancher said little when he heard, but his eyes hardened. He had lived long enough to know how such stories ended. Soon, signs of trouble appeared close to home. One morning, they found the fence line cut, posts splintered as though struck with axes. The cattle had been driven off in the night, hooves scattering across the hills. Later, smoke rose from a neighbor's barn, black and heavy, curling against the pale sky until it disappeared. The woman stood with the rancher as they watched the smoke drift, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. She saw the line of his jaw, grim and steady, his hands flexing at his sides as if they already held the rifle. That night, by firelight, he polished the weapon, running cloth along the barrel until it gleamed. He moved with a patience born of necessity, though his silence was thick. She watched him, her chest heavy with a knowing she could not ignore. Her exile had left her with many losses, but not all skills had been stripped from her. Before fear had marked her as an outcast, her people had taught her the bow, the knife, the art of watching and waiting. Her hands remembered what her heart had tried to forget. She would not be useless now. When he set the rifle aside, she took up her knife, laying the blade across her palm. The firelight licked its edge, bright and cold. Her braid hung loose down her back, and with a slow, deliberate hand, she tied it tight. It was no longer a mark of kinship, but of readiness. The days that followed held a quiet tension. She learned to read the land as he did, the bent grass where hooves had passed, the hush of birds silenced by strangers' approach. The rancher spoke sparingly, but his eyes met hers often, and in them she saw not doubt but recognition. He knew she would stand with him, though no words bound them. Then came the night the riders drew near. Hooves thundered over the plains, distant at first, then closer, rolling like storm clouds across the earth. The cattle bawled in panic, their cries rising above the rush of wind. The rancher stood by the door, rifle in hand, his face lit by the faint glow of the fire. She joined him, her knife sheathed at her side, her shawl cast aside for freedom of movement. They waited in silence. The air smelled of rain and dust, sharp and heavy. Her breath came steady, though her heart raced. For the first time since her exile, she felt not like prey but like a hunter, poised and ready. The riders came fast, dark shapes breaking against the horizon, their shouts carried on the wind. The rancher lifted his rifle, the barrel steady. She moved with him, keeping low, every step precise. The night exploded with sound, the crack of rifle fire, the scream of horses, the clash of men hungry for what was not theirs. She fought with a silence that startled even her. Her knife flashed in the firelight, each motion sure, each strike measured. Her braid whipped against her back as she moved, no longer a chain of memory but a banner of defiance. The rancher's rifle thundered beside her, his face grim but unyielding. The clash was chaos, hoofbeats pounding, sparks leaping from stone, the acrid scent of gunpowder thick in the air. Yet amid the storm she found clarity. Exile had not stolen her strength. It had only buried it beneath shame. Now, in the heat of danger, that strength rose again, fierce and unbroken, and, when the last rider fell back into the night, the silence that followed was staggering. Smoke drifted in the air, mingling with the stench of sweat and blood. The cattle, scattered, began to settle again, their cries fading to uneasy murmurs. The woman stood with her knife still in hand, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. The rancher lowered his rifle, his shoulders heaving. They did not speak at once. Words seemed too small for what had passed between them in that fire-lit clash. Instead, their eyes met, and in that gaze lay the truth. She was no longer merely surviving. She had fought, not only for herself, but for the land, for the man who had given her firelight and silence instead of scorn. Her exile had cast her adrift, stripped her of tribe, name, belonging. But in the thunder of rifles and hoofbeats, she had discovered something exile could not take: her will, her courage, her claim upon life itself. As dawn broke pale over the horizon, she stood beside the rancher, watching the plains stretch endless before them. The land was scarred but unbroken. So was she. And for the first time she felt that what she defended was not borrowed, not fragile smoke in the wind, but something worth keeping. Winter came early, carried on winds that cut through the plains like knives. Snow gathered first in the hollows, then climbed steadily, drifting against the porch rails until the boards disappeared beneath white silence. The world beyond the cabin seemed buried, hushed under a weight of frost. Inside, firelight painted the walls gold, shadows flickering across the wooden beams like memories refusing to die. The rancher nursed a wound from the fight. The bullet had not taken his life, but it left its mark in the flesh of his shoulder. His breath grew shallow when the pain deepened, his face pale against the pillow. The rifle rested untouched by the door, its presence a reminder of battles won and dangers yet to come. She kept vigil beside him. Her shawl wrapped close, she boiled coffee each morning, the rich, bitter scent filling the room even when he was too weak to drink more than a swallow. She cleaned the wound with careful hands, binding it with strips torn from her own garments. When the fever rose, she placed a damp cloth against his brow, whispering words her people once used for comfort. Old songs, low and steady, drifted into the dim room, not to summon the tribe back, for that door was closed, but to keep him tethered to the world when shadows pulled hard at his spirit. There was a scar on her own side, pale and constant, a reminder of her exile. She touched it sometimes as she worked, feeling the echo of her own pain reflected in his. His wound was fresh, hers old, but together they formed a silence that needed no language. They were marked differently, yet carried the same burden, to go on despite the hollows carved in them. Outside, the storm howled, snow pressing thick against the windows. She fed the fire with what wood remained, each log consumed by flame, casting a warmth that was more than physical. The light revealed the lines of his face, worn by grief yet softened now by sleep. She sat near him, mending small things, his shirts, her shawl, even the loose buttons from his coat, though her hands often stilled, her eyes lingering on him as though watching him breathe was itself an act of prayer. In tending him, she began to mend herself. The loneliness that had clung to her since exile loosened in the quiet rhythm of care. She no longer felt like a shadow haunting another's home. Her place was here beside the fire, keeping watch when he could not. His scars and hers, different stories, different wounds, spoke the same truth. Survival was not meant to be carried alone. As the snow deepened, so too did the bond between them. It was not spoken aloud. There were no promises exchanged, no declarations made beneath the storm. What grew between them was quieter, forged in small acts. Her hand steadying the cup as he drank, his faint smile when he saw her shawl draped over his shoulders instead of her own. Nights stretched long. The fire burned low. The wind rattled the cabin, and still she sat close, humming songs until his breathing steadied. Sometimes she caught him watching her, eyes half-lidded but clear enough to hold her in their gaze. No words passed, but the silence itself became a language, one that said, "You are not alone." Not anymore. By the time the storm broke and the first clear dawn spread across the snow, the wound had begun to close. His strength was slow to return, yet life pulsed steady in him again. She rose that morning and stepped onto the porch, the snow bright enough to blind her eyes. She breathed deep of the cold air, sharp as glass, and felt the truth settle within her. Belonging did not always come from birth, or from tribe, or from the braids that once bound her to a circle of women now lost to her. Belonging could be built anew, quiet and fragile as firelight against the snow, but no less real. Inside, the rancher stirred, and she turned back, carrying the warmth of that realization with her. Spring returned slowly, as if the land itself needed convincing that winter had truly passed. At first it came in shy touches, the sound of meltwater trickling beneath the crust of snow, the faint green of shoots breaking through the thawed earth. Then the hills dressed themselves in grass again, a rolling sea of color that swayed beneath the wind. The cattle grazed in peace, their hides glistening under sunlight that no longer bit with frost. The ranch house, weathered and scarred, still stood strong. It had endured storm and fire, the weight of hooves and the smoke of battle, yet its beams held, its hearth glowed. The woman stood on the porch, her shawl lifted by the spring breeze, and let her eyes stretch across the plain. Where once she had seen only exile and emptiness, now she saw fields worth tending, fences worth mending, a life worth shaping with her own hands. She no longer walked as one cast out. Shoulders bent beneath the memory of rejection, she walked as a keeper. Each step she took across the land pressed her claim not in words but in action. In the morning she braided her hair, not in sorrow as before, not as a chain of remembrance but as a symbol of choice. Each braid was a binding of old and new, a weaving of memory and possibility. What had once been taken from her by exile, she now remade for herself. The rancher sat often in his rocking chair, the rifle resting by the door, ready if ever the horizon darkened again. His face was lined, his body marked by scars that would never fully heal, yet there was a steadiness in him now. Contentment did not shine like joy but settled deep, like roots holding firm in the soil. She saw it in the way he breathed slower, in the way his hands no longer clutched the rifle with restless need. Between them stretched a bond built not on sudden declarations, but on seasons endured side by side. She brewed the coffee each dawn, placing a cup at his side before he even rose. He brought in the wood for the fire, setting it by the hearth so she would not have to fetch it alone. They spoke when words were needed, but often their silences spoke more. A glance at the table shared, a quiet laugh at the stubborn mule, the sound of rocking chair creaks answered by the rustle of her braid as she bent over her work. She no longer looked back toward the tribe that had turned her away. At first, their absence had been a wound she could not stop touching, raw and constant. Now it was a scar she carried but did not fear. She did not wait for their voices to call her home again. She did not ache for their approval. The land, the cabin, the cattle, the fire, these things had claimed her instead. And in their claiming, she had found a belonging that the tribe could never take away. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she stood with the rancher at the porch rail. The sky blazed like fire above the hills, clouds burning with gold at their edges. The cattle moved slow in the distance, their shadows long. He leaned on the rail, his hand rough, scarred, steady beside hers. No words passed between them. Yet she felt the weight of a vow unspoken. Not a promise sealed in ceremony, not a binding written in ink, but an oath nonetheless that they would keep one another, not out of duty or fear, but out of the simple, quiet truth that they already had. In that moment she understood. Exile had not been an end. It had been a beginning, harsh and cruel, yes, but a path that led her here, to firelight, to scars shared without shame, to a rocking chair that creaked steady in the night, to hands that did not turn her away. She had once thought herself cursed, her body a burden too heavy for kinship to bear. Now she knew different. The body that had carried her through dust and hunger, through storm and blood, was not a curse. It was her strength. It was her vessel of survival, her mark of endurance, her claim upon life. The rancher shifted beside her, and the sound of his chair creaking drifted faintly through the open door. She braided her hair tighter against the wind, her fingers moving with calm assurance. For the first time she smiled not with caution but with quiet triumph. The land breathed again, so did she.